Good morning, y'all. I want to talk today about a story that has been sitting in the back of my mind since it first came out a few weeks ago, because the more I dig into the actual science behind it, the more I understand why seismologists are treating it so seriously. This is not breaking news about an earthquake that already happened. This is something arguably more important than that. New research about a single specific point on the map in Southern California that scientists now believe could determine how big the region's next major earthquake actually turns out to be. And I want to walk y'all through exactly what was found, exactly what a fault junction is and why this particular one matters so much, and exactly what the science does and does not tell us about the timeline for something happening. Let's start with the location, because everything about this story centers on one specific spot. Northeast of Los Angeles, tucked between the San Bernardino Mountains, sits a place called Cajun Pass. If you have ever driven Interstate 15 between the Los Angeles Basin and Las Vegas, you have physically passed through it, probably without giving it a second thought. But underneath that unremarkable mountain pass is one of the most geologically complicated pieces of ground in all of North America, because it is the exact point where two of California's most dangerous fault systems, the San Andreas Fault and the San Jacinto Fault, converge and interact with each other. This is not just two faults sitting near one another. This is a junction, a place where the fault geometry itself gets genuinely complicated, where stress from one fault system can transfer into the other, and where the behavior of an earthquake rupture becomes much harder to predict than it is along a simple, single, straight fault line. A team of researchers, led by Lilian Burkhardt at the University of Bern in Switzerland, working alongside colleagues including Catherine Scherer and David Sandwell, published a study on June the 3rd in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth, that took an entirely new approach to understanding this junction. Instead of relying primarily on the historical earthquake catalog, which for Southern California only stretches back a relatively short distance in geological terms, the team built a physics-based model that reconstructed roughly 1,000 years of stress accumulation and release along the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems. I want to explain what that actually means because I think the method here is genuinely important context for understanding how much weight to put on the results. Faults do not just sit there doing nothing between earthquakes. As the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate grind past each other at the San Andreas boundary, stress slowly, continuously builds up in the rock along the fault, locked in place by friction, until eventually that stress exceeds what the rock can hold and it releases suddenly as an earthquake. By modeling that entire loading and unloading process across a full millennium, the research team was able to estimate not just how much stress exists on these faults today, but how that stress level compares to the full range of what has occurred historically along this same stretch of ground. And what they found is genuinely striking. According to the study, several fault segments near Cajun Pass have reached or exceeded their highest modeled stress levels in approximately 1,000 years, as of the most recent data included in the model. I want to be precise about what that means, because a claim like that can sound abstract until you put it in plain terms. This is not saying an earthquake is guaranteed. It is saying that, based on the physics of how much energy has been loading into this fault system since the last major rupture, the amount of stored, unreleased energy sitting in the rock right now is higher than at almost any other point the model can reconstruct going back 1,000 years. Think of it like a spring that has been slowly, steadily compressed for over a century and a half without being allowed to release. And the model is telling us that spring is now compressed further than it has been and longer than we have really been able to measure directly. That century and a half figure is not a random number I picked either. It connects directly to the last time this exact stretch of fault actually ruptured in a major way. The last significant earthquake to strike the broader Los Angeles region along this section of the San Andreas system was the Fort Tejon earthquake of 1857, an estimated magnitude 7.9 event, one of the largest earthquakes in California's recorded history. Since 1857, this section of fault has been essentially locked, quietly accumulating stress without a major release, and that unusually long, quiet period is exactly the pattern that seismologists watching this region have grown increasingly concerned about over the years. A long, quiet period on a major fault is not automatically reassuring. In a lot of cases, it is the opposite. It can mean the fault is simply overdue for the kind of large release that keeps these systems in long-term balance. Now here is where this study introduces something genuinely new to the conversation, something beyond just confirming that stress is high, and it is the part I find most fascinating from a pure science communication standpoint. The research team introduced a concept they are calling an earthquake gate. And Cajun Pass, according to their modeling, functions as exactly that kind of gate for this fault system. I want to explain this concept carefully because I think it is genuinely one of the more useful new ideas to come out of earthquake science in a while. When a rupture begins somewhere along a fault and starts propagating, tearing through the rock and releasing stress as it goes, That rupture eventually reaches points of geometric complexity, like a junction where one fault meets another. At that junction, the rupture faces a kind of decision point. It can stop there, staying confined to the single fault it started on. Or, if conditions are right, it can jump across the junction and continue rupturing onto the second fault system entirely, effectively turning what would have been a large earthquake into a dramatically larger one. Burkhardt and her team describe Kagan Pass as a junction that does not simply block ruptures or simply pass them through in a fixed, predictable way. Instead, it responds dynamically to the stress conditions present at the time, conditions that themselves change over centuries as the surrounding fault segments load and unload. In other words, whether Kagan Pass acts as a gate that stays shut, confining a future rupture to one fault, or a gate that swings open, letting the rupture spread across both the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems simultaneously, depends on the specific stress state of the surrounding fault segments at the moment a rupture arrives there. I want you all to understand why that distinction, single fault rupture versus cross fault rupture, matters so enormously for the people living in this region. An earthquake that ruptures a single fault segment, even a long one, releases a certain calculable amount of energy and produces a certain range of expected magnitudes based on the length of fault involved. But an earthquake that manages to jump the gate at Kagan Pass and rupture across both the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems together is an entirely different animal, involving a dramatically longer total rupture length, and rupture length is one of the primary factors that determines an earthquake's ultimate magnitude. A cross-system rupture through this junction could produce a substantially larger, longer duration, more damaging earthquake than a rupture confined to either fault individually. And according to the study's authors, current stress conditions on both sides of that junction resemble the conditions that are believed to have preceded some of the region's largest historical earthquakes. That is the sentence from this research that I think deserves the most attention, because it is not saying an earthquake is imminent in some specific window of days or weeks. It is saying the physical conditions right now look like the kind of conditions that historically have set the stage for the big ones. I do want to be very careful and very responsible here about what this study is not saying, because I think this is exactly the kind of finding that gets distorted and sensationalized as it spreads, and I do not want to contribute to that. Dr. Burkhardt herself has been explicit and direct about this point in discussing the research, emphasizing that the study is not a prediction of when an earthquake will occur. Earthquake science, even with a model this sophisticated, still cannot tell us the exact time, the exact location within the broader system, or the exact magnitude of the next major rupture. What a physics-based model like this one provides is a clearer, more grounded picture of the current stress state of the system, and a better sense of the range of scenarios that officials, engineers, and residents should be prepared for. That distinction between hazard assessment and prediction is one I try to draw clearly every single time I cover earthquake science on this channel, because the two get conflated constantly in casual conversation, and conflating them either creates false alarm or false complacency, neither of which serves anybody well. Let me also touch on why this particular junction affects so many people, because Kagan Pass is not some remote, empty stretch of desert. It sits directly adjacent to several of the most densely populated communities in Southern California, including the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area, San Bernardino, Riverside, and the Coachella Valley. Depending on exactly how a future rupture through this system unfolds, whether it stays confined to a single fault or spreads across both through the Kagan Pass gate, the shaking intensity, the duration of that shaking, and the geographic footprint of significant damage could look dramatically different across this entire metro region, which is home to well over 10 million people when you account for the full extended Los Angeles basin. This is exactly the kind of research that emergency planners, structural engineers, and infrastructure agencies use directly in their own hazard modeling, because knowing that a specific junction has this gate-like, condition-dependent behavior helps them plan for a wider, more realistic range of earthquake scenarios, rather than assuming every future event will look like a simple, single-fault rupture. I also want to explain a bit about the modeling tool itself, because I think it is worth understanding how researchers actually calculate something like Coulomb stress across a fault system, since that term is going to come up if you read the original study. Coulomb stress modeling is a technique that calculates how stress transfers through the crust following fault movement, essentially mapping out where an earthquake, or even the slow, steady accumulation of tectonic loading over time, has made a nearby fault segment more or less likely to fail. When researchers overlay decades and centuries of this stress transfer onto a detailed map of the fault geometry, they get a color-coded picture showing which segments are sitting closest to their failure threshold at any given point in the model's timeline. That is exactly the kind of map the burn team produced for present-day conditions along the southern San Andreas system. And it is that map that shows several segments near Kagan Pass sitting at or above their highest modeled stress point in roughly 1,000 years of reconstructed history. I think it is also worth mentioning that this study does not exist in isolation. It builds on and connects with decades of prior work by seismologists across Southern California, including ongoing monitoring using GPS networks that track slow, millimeter-scale surface motion across the fault system, seismometer networks that detect the small, frequent earthquakes that occur constantly along these faults, paleoseismology, meaning field studies that dig into the ground to physically find and date evidence of ancient fault ruptures going back centuries, and laboratory experiments that test how different types of rock actually behave and fail under stress. This new physics-based 1,000-year model adds an important, longer historical perspective to that existing body of work, but it does not replace the value of ongoing real-time monitoring, and researchers have been clear that future observations from all of these methods will continue to be compared against the model's results, helping refine and improve the science over time as better evidence comes in. So let me bring this all together because I know a story like this raises the question everybody actually wants answered, which is simple. Should people in Southern California be doing anything differently because of this? And my honest answer is this. This study does not tell you to panic, and it does not give you a date to circle on the calendar. What it should do is reinforce something that has always been true for anybody living in earthquake country, which is that preparedness needs to be an ongoing habit, not a one-time checkbox you complete and forget about. If you live anywhere across the greater Los Angeles basin, the Inland Empire, San Bernardino, Riverside, or the Coachella Valley, this is a good moment to actually check your own household's earthquake readiness, rather than assuming you will deal with it whenever the ground eventually shakes. That means having water, non-perishable food, flashlights, a battery-powered or hand-crank radio, and any needed medications stored together and easy to grab. It means knowing how to shut off your gas line if you smell gas after shaking stops, since ruptured gas lines are one of the leading causes of post-earthquake fires. It means securing heavy furniture, bookshelves, and water heaters to wall studs so they cannot tip over during strong shaking. And for anybody in a multi-story building, it means genuinely knowing your evacuation route and your building-specific earthquake protocol, not just assuming you'll figure it out in the moment. This research is a reminder, delivered through very careful, very rigorous science, that the fault system running underneath Southern California has been quietly loading energy for over a century and a half, and that the specific junction where two of its most significant faults meet may behave in a way that determines whether the region's next major earthquake stays contained or becomes something considerably larger. That is not a countdown clock. It is a call to take the hazard seriously and to keep your own preparedness current, exactly the same way I ask y'all to stay ready during an active, severe weather pattern. Except here the trigger, whenever it eventually comes, will not arrive with days of forecast lead time. It will arrive with no warning at all, which is exactly why the preparation has to happen now, while things are calm, rather than after the shaking starts. I want to spend a little more time on the earthquake gate concept itself, because Cajun Pass is not the first place in the world where scientists have identified this kind of junction behavior, and putting it in that broader context helps explain why researchers take the concept so seriously. Similar step-over and junction zones have been studied along other major strike-slip fault systems around the world, including sections of Turkey's North Anatolian Fault and New Zealand's Alpine Fault, and in more than one documented case, historical ruptures that reached a junction like this did in fact jump across it, producing an earthquake substantially larger than what either individual fault segment would have produced on its own. The 1999 Izmit earthquake in Turkey is often cited in this kind of discussion because the rupture that year propagated along a lengthy stretch of the North Anatolian Fault and involved exactly this kind of multi-segment behavior, contributing to why that earthquake proved so devastating. What makes the burn team's contribution genuinely novel is that instead of only studying junction behavior after the fact, by reconstructing how a past earthquake happened to jump or not jump across a gate, they built a forward-looking, physics-based framework that estimates the current likelihood of a gate staying closed or swinging open based on the present stress state of the surrounding fault segments. And that the same modeling approach could be applied to other complex fault junctions anywhere in the world where two or more major fault systems meet, which is part of why this research has drawn attention well beyond the earthquake science community focused specifically on Southern California. It is also worth understanding a bit more about why the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems specifically carry so much hazard for this region in the first place, since that context helps explain why researchers have spent so much effort studying this junction rather than some other stretch of California's fault network. The San Andreas Fault is the primary boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, running roughly 800 miles through California, and the section south of the Cajun Pass area, sometimes referred to by researchers as the Southern San Andreas, is widely regarded by seismologists as one of the most hazardous sections of the entire fault, specifically because of how long it has gone since its last major rupture. The San Jacinto Fault runs largely parallel to the San Andreas through the same region, slightly to the west, and while individually it tends to produce more frequent but somewhat smaller earthquakes than the San Andreas, it is capable of significant events on its own. And the fact that it converges with the San Andreas system right at Quezon Pass is exactly what creates the junction complexity this new study focuses on. Southern California sits atop this convergence of major, capable faults, specifically because the Pacific Plate here is sliding northwestward relative to the North American Plate at a rate of roughly 2 inches per year. A slow, steady, relentless motion that, over the course of centuries, adds up to enormous amounts of accumulated displacement and, correspondingly, enormous amounts of stored stress in the rock along the boundary faults that accommodate that motion. If you found this breakdown helpful, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I want to keep bringing y'all the real science behind stories like this one, explained clearly and without the exaggeration that so much of this coverage tends to get dragged into online. Share this video with anybody you know living across Southern California, because understanding what this research actually says and does not say is exactly the kind of information that helps people prepare calmly instead of reacting to fear. I will keep watching for updates as more research comes out of this fault system, and I will bring y'all the next piece of the story the moment there's something new to report. Stay informed, stay prepared, and I love y'all.